Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I want to start first off. You heard a little bit about my background. I identify as a loss survivor, also somebody with lived experience. And knowing that I'm not the only one in the room that is in that situation, I just want to, note that, yeah, we'll be talking about mean safety, and I will do my best to avoid any activating content. That being said, if you have to step out, if you need to take a beat or a break, please know that I won't take any disrespect. Again, I will do my best to avoid, but by the nature of talking about mean safety, we kind of have to step into the mud a little bit. But I just wanted to start by saying that first and foremost. Another thing I wanted to mention, that zero suicide, striving for zero, 100% preventable. I work in suicide prevention. I've done it since I was 17 years old. And yes, I would love to assume that we can prevent every suicide. The reality is I've had to accept that over the years. I thought once I got involved in this work, I would become immune to suicide, right? I work in suicide prevention. I can't possibly lose somebody. And in that time, I've lost someone I care deeply about. Am I doing all right? Can you guys hear me? And as you'll learn later, it's impacted me more directly than that. So I agree that, yeah, we shoot for what we can, but no, it's unrealistic to think that we'll ever get to zero. But I agree that we should strive. We keep aiming for that. So is anybody at fault? No. But we do what we can. And the one thing that I've learned working in this field is you do as much as you can, as hard as you can, as long as you can. And I want to at least look back on it, either my life, or the people I train, the people I help support, to know that we did everything at every possible opportunity. But the reality is, and this is not with any disrespect meant, part of the key is helping that person find the reasons for living. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'm going to anyway. I actually am going to largely ignore my slides. I promise I'll still talk about it. But the reason why I got involved in this work is after I lost my friend, it was my freshman year in high school. And my senior year in high school, I got involved with something called the Yellow Ribbon Program down in San Diego. And I brought it to my high school, and the day after we did the assembly, and if I can just try, like, this was the late 90s. This is the dark ages of suicide prevention, right? And we flew the founders out. They were about to give their speech, and they looked at me right like 5 minutes before they were going to give their talk. And there was 3,000 of my classmates crammed in the gym to have this very intimate conversation about suicide. And I say that with sarcasm because obviously 3,000 students crammed in the gym is the worst possible venue to talk about suicide. But they looked at me and they said, "Hey, what are you going to say?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? If you build it, they will come. I raised the money. I flew out here. Like, they're here. You're here. Do your thing." They said, "We think your classmates would benefit from hearing from you." So I ended up reading a poem that I'd written in memory of my friend. And so again, if you can try to put yourself in my shoes, I'm standing in front of my entire school, my senior year. Not only am I reading poetry, but I'm reading poetry about suicide prevention. So needless to say, I'm mortified. But the next day I got a letter from one of my classmates, a girl named Sarah, that said she'd been thinking about suicide. And yet she showed up on a day at school where for the first time she heard someone else say the S word. And I was 17 years old, no training in mental health, no training in suicide prevention. But she thanked me for the pain that I had shared in response to losing my friend. Because when we're thinking about suicide, we convince ourselves that the world would be better off without us. We convince ourselves that it would be easier for them if we weren't hearing it. She told me that it caused her to take a step back. But she also thanked me for sharing my hope. Because I, to this day, believe that one of the greatest honors that we can ever have is to be asked to sit with somebody in the mud until they find their hope again. Sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. But again, I just hope that we can look back and know that we did everything in every possible chance. And that being said, as a loss survivor, there were times where I didn't know what to do. And it took me a while to come to terms with this statement. I'm not sure who said it first, but I can only hold myself accountable for what I know today, not what I will learn tomorrow. So with that, I hope you're going to walk away today a little bit more informed. I think, more importantly, I hope you're going to walk away feeling a little bit more comfortable. Slides looking good. Everybody can see, hear, everything's good online. All right, great. One other thing I want to mention, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but another area that I work in a lot is called it's messaging around suicide prevention. So I just want to introduce you or remind you of some terminology, the recommended terminology from the suicide prevention community. So when someone has died by suicide, the most common term we use is what? That they have committed suicide, right? So let's fill in the blank, do a little word association game with me. What are some other actions that we commit? We commit. This is the interactive part. Okay. What are some of the other actions that we commit? We commit crime, we commit adultery, we commit sins, we commit a lot of negative things. Now, you also committed to showing up on a Saturday. You commit to your friendships, your family. So committing to something isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that term committed brings with it a connotation of crime and sin. A lot of people are surprised to find out it used to be illegal to attempt suicide. A lot of faith institutions are starting to change the way they frame suicide. In fact, the Jesuit order, the Catholic Church a couple of years ago declassified suicide as mortal sin, which I didn't know that you can do, but that's awesome that they did it, because they realized that classifying suicide as a sin doesn't stop it from having it, stops me from asking for help or having thoughts about doing a sin. Another term, or a couple other terms we want to avoid is successful, unsuccessful, or failed. There's simply no failure or success when we're talking about this issue. And then you might have also noticed a few minutes ago, I said I was going to avoid any activating content. Now we're trying to replace that with the term triggering for fairly obvious reasons. The term triggering is activating, especially for folks who have been victims of violence, firearm violence, especially firearm by suicide. So now that I've gone off the cuff for a waste of 10 minutes, I will go ahead and jump in and try to stay on time. All right, so let's talk about mean safety. And Doctor, thank you for bringing it in and emphasizing this a little bit during your talk. What I'm hoping to do is kind of talk to you about a little bit of background, history, why this is important, show you a little bit of data. Hopefully I won't bore you with it, but really repress the need, and then really leave you with some best practices for this. So, all right, now this is not just me saying it's important. The national strategy, local strategies, as well as our statewide plan that was updated in 2020 called for us to do a better job around mean safety. And we'll talk around, mean safety is kind of the more modern term for what used to be referred to as restricting or reducing access to lethal means. Now it kind of falls under this umbrella of mean safety. So when I say mean safety today, just want to be clear that that's what I mean. But we want to help create safer environments. And that doesn't mean putting more people in hospitals or jails. That means helping people and their friends and families to make their environment safer during times of crisis. So we're going to get into way greater detail about that. All right, so let's talk about some of the background. So mean safety is actually, if you go through and you look at all the different types of research about what works for suicide prevention, mean safety is the most evidence research-based strategy to reduce suicide deaths. Now, that doesn't mean it reduces the pain and suffering that comes along or leads to thoughts of suicide, but as far as reducing actual deaths, and so much of what we've done, and as a loss survivor, in the times that I've lost people, it's always the why, right? It's always the why. What could have been prevented? And I think of the why, I use this analogy, I assume many of you are familiar with board game Jenga. You stack up these blocks, you pull out these blocks, and eventually somebody pulls out a block that causes the whole thing to fall apart. And we say, oh, well, you lost because that one block caused everything to fall apart. Now, the reality, it wasn't that one block, right? It was all the other pieces that weakened that foundation. So that one last block was the straw that broke the camel's back. And using this as a metaphor for suicide, we always want to point to the breakup, the bullying, the job loss, the mental health concerns, or whatever it may be. And in reality, it's so complex that we can't oversimplify it. Now, we can't necessarily prevent bad things from happening in people's lives, from those blocks getting pulled out. What we can do is be connected and vigilant, both as mental health professionals, as family and friends, as support networks, to realize when those blocks are getting pulled out, to come in and help reinforce that structure, to make it so that that next block, when it gets pulled out, isn't going to cause everything to fall apart. One of the key ways we do that is through mean safety. I think I pressed, oh, there we go. I did a skip, oh, we're good, sorry. All right, so when it comes to mean safety, it comes with, a lot of times there's this assumption that someone, if they have more intent, more determination, more desire to die, they will choose a more lethal means, and that's simply not the case. And going back and talking to folks who have made attempts or nearly made attempts, intent really wasn't the determining factor in what means or method that they use. And this is a weird place to go, but if we were to ask 10 people who were having thoughts of suicide, in which way or manner would you attempt suicide, that list is going to be different for each person. And that list is also going to include ways that, okay, I would do this or this, but I would never do that or that. And again, it's going to vary, but that variation is not determined by intent. However, the lethality of the attempt is determined by the means. And again, this is where I'm going to touch on some activated stuff, so I apologize. We know that firearms are lethal, perhaps the most lethal form of a suicide attempt. And that's why these efforts around means safety are so important, because there is no window for rescue. There is no window for someone to change their mind, for someone to come home, as opposed to the most common method of suicide attempt, which is overdose or poisoning. which oftentimes is actually non-lethal, even though the risk of damage to or injury to the body is hugely important. Now, the most important data point I want to point out on this is right here. A lot of people don't realize that 90% of people who make a suicide attempt will not go on to die by suicide within their lifetime. In fact, 70% of people who make an attempt will never attempt again in their lives. And so we have got to stop treating attempt survivors and people with lived experience like they need baby gloves and they're this fragile piece of glass that we need to carry for the rest of their lives. Most people, in fact, experience post-traumatic growth. But the important part is that we need to get them. Hopefully we can avoid the attempt at all. But if there is an attempt made, how do we reduce access to the most lethal forms of that? And this has been replicated in numerous studies I'm going to show you, but one of the most, well, this is actually a great place to start. If this is kind of new information to you, meansmatter.org is from Harvard University School of Public Health. They were really one of the first entities that brought all this research to the forefront. It really helped us to explain and understand why should we be talking about mean safety. And mean safety is a huge part of the Zero Suicide Initiative and just about every best practice strategy that's out there. And as I mentioned, this has been replicated in numerous studies across across the world, internationally. And a lot of times people think that, I'm from San Diego. So in San Diego, there's a huge effort underway right now with Caltrans and the Coronado Bay community to reinforce the Coronado structural bridge barriers. And the kind of cheap response from folks is, well, won't they just go somewhere else, or won't they just find another way? When in fact, that is just a way to kick the can down the road. What the research actually shows us is no, that's not true. Is that when you reduce access to the most lethal means of suicide within a society, of course suicides using that mechanism go down, but suicides overall go down. Now, mean safety is not a perfect science. Sometimes we do know, this barrier will prevent people from getting in. If we remove the firearms from the home, which is something we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, that's important. But we also have to be flexible, and it's not always this perfect barrier. Sometimes it's about speed bumps. Sometimes it's just about more time and space between someone who's having those thoughts and access to those most lethal means. And again, it's never going to be perfect, but we just have to do the best we can. But this whole idea, just won't they find another way? In my opinion, again, is a cheap response, and it's just it's a lack of information. That's just this mentality of, well, we're just kicking the can down the road. If we put up a barrier, they're going to grab a gun. If they grab the gun, then or take away the gun, they're going to reach for the pills. If we take away the pills, and again, the research says otherwise. If you take away access to the most lethal forms, not only do suicides using that mechanism go down, suicides overall will go down. So those are just some of the basic principles I wanted to walk in this conversation with today. So how do we actually do this? How do we actually implement mean safety? For one, we can put the person in a safer environment. For a long time, that's what we tried to do. We assumed that hospitals were perfectly safe and jails were perfectly safe. And what we call controlled environments, there was no way for someone to attempt suicide in a controlled environment. What we found is we can do a lot of things, but there's no such thing as a perfectly suicide-safe environment. I don't care who you think you are. There's no way to make an environment 100% perfectly safe. It's about wanting the person to find their reasons for living. Now, another component of that is we can put barriers between the things, like we talked about. Put the guns in a safe, put a barrier on the bridge. Short of that, just putting time and space. A lot of times people will say, well, what's the point of putting a gun in a safe and keeping the gun unloaded if I'm the one that has the ammo and I'm the one that has the key to the gun? Well, now, again, this is an activating analogy. I apologize. How many actions does it take to pick up a firearm and shoot it? 2, right? Pick up the gun, you pull the trigger, 2 actions. Now, what if that gun is in a safe, and what if the ammo is located somewhere different? And what if the key is in a third different location? Now I have to go get the key, I need to unlock the safe, I need to get the firearm, now I need to go over and get the ammo. And each one of those is an opportunity for me for my self-preservation, that hope, that pain to reduce just a little bit, to give me that moment. Maybe on that gun lock, it's that national lifeline that I've read 100 times, but it never really sank in that maybe that's something I should do. Or one of the examples over in Europe, there was a certain medication that was being used in a high number of suicides. And so they did 2 things. They took 2 steps. One, they changed the prescription. So rather than being 3 months, they brought it down to 2 or 3 weeks. And they changed it from a bottle to a blister pack. And again, I apologize if this is activating. How many steps does it take to attempt suicide using pills in a bottle? You unscrew the cap, you pour them in your hand, you swallow the pills. 3 actions. What if I have 100 pills in a blister pack? It's 100 individual actions. That's 97 more steps that I would have to take before I can, get to a lethal amount. And this specific packaging has saved one of my friend's mother's lives. By the time she got to a lethal dose, the first party kicked in and she passed out. She was never able to consume a lethal dose. And again, that's not perfect science. That's not a restrictive barrier per se. It's time and space. And it's opportunities for people either to rescue themselves or to be rescued. That's part of making this all less lethal. So, looking at different mean safety campaigns, whether we're talking about prescriptions or firearms or bridges, there's kind of looking at all these kind of three key components or elements that I've found over the last few years. One is just public awareness, right? Brochures, posters, PSAs, letting people know, hey, this is the thing, kind of pushing back against those myths. Of course, we want to engage with gatekeeper trainings. Over the past couple of years, I've been really proud to partner with UCSD, and we've been training pharmacists across the state in suicide prevention. They are the gatekeepers, and in fact, I would suggest that they're the most accessible form of healthcare. If I want to see my doctor, they'll probably tell me tomorrow or next week. I can drive down the street right now to CVS and go see a pharmacist within the next 15 minutes. They're super accessible, and not to be overly dramatic, they are giving the means and methods potentially across that counter, so they have to be at the forefront of this. As you're going to hear more when we talk about firearms, firearm instructors. Gunshot owners, the most trusted source of information for firearm owners is those individuals, so having them get on board. As we talk more about firearms later, I've been so impressed with the firearm community's willingness to jump in and emphasize suicide prevention. And then of course, lethal means counseling, which if you're not familiar, I think there's previous discussion on this, counseling for mental health professionals, for healthcare providers, having a conversation about what steps are you taking to keep yourself safe. So those are kind of the three key elements. We'll break this down a little bit more. All right, I'm not going to talk too much about data. The main thing, and this should come as no surprise to anybody, and I apologize for not bringing LA specific data, but it's pretty consistent across the board. Firearms are typically the most common form of suicide in our counties, in our state, across our country. And so even if we can make small gains in firearm suicides, we can make huge gains in overall suicide prevention and the lethality of these attempts. Now, unfortunately, looking at hanging and suffocation, this is a mean and method that has been dramatically increasing over the past few years. One of the tough parts about that one is it's actually pretty difficult to restrict access to lethal means for that mean and mechanism. So a lot of times we have to be a little bit more invasive with our response. I'm always the person that says we need to respond to risk in the least restrictive setting, but if that is their preferred or chosen mean or method, that is one where we need to be a little bit more invasive and a little bit more acute with our response. Now, one of the most frustrating things, again, in doing research is for anybody who works in a hospital setting or mental health facility, see law enforcement in the back, jail settings, a facility can go and buy a sink. It's called a suicide safe sink or a suicide safe door or there's pretty much a suicide safe everything. Now, the frustrating part is those sinks and those doors cost about $600 to $1,000, when a sink on the Home Depot costs about $50. So one of my personal things I would love to see happen is for the average person to be able to walk into Home Depot and go to a suicide safe section. Because I know that I would drop a few $100s to safeguard my residents if I had somebody in my environment, but it's cost prohibitive, and there's no reason why those things should cost that much more. So that's just me on my soapbox. I apologize, but in case any of you are engineers and want to partner with me, I'd love that. All right, so I mentioned this previously, but if we can get small gains in firearm suicides, we can make a huge impact across the board on this issue. All right, so we are going to jump into a conversation about firearms. So again, just that activation warning. I'll do this with as much respect as I can, but I just want to talk with you a little bit about this. So I am a firearm owner. I come from a family of law enforcement. My brother, my mom, my dad, my brother, all cops, aunts, uncles, pretty much everybody but me. So I am the black sheep of my family. I'm an EMT as well, so I kind of got a little respect from the back. They're hugely supportive of what I do, but so by no means am I anti-gun. I'm kind of sit somewhere in the middle, but just looking at the data, just stepping completely away from the emotional aspect of it, having a gun in the home, having guns in the environment, having guns within a state, gun laws that are less restrictive, increases risk of suicide. More rural communities where we see higher gun ownership, we see higher rates of suicide. While LA has the highest number of suicides within our state, you actually have the lowest rate. So there's just some things to think about. It's not just this black and white issue. But let's talk about some of the different firearm components. So one of the things that has been a myth about suicide and firearms for a long time is for the first, I don't know, 2 decades of my career, the thinking was the average person who dies by suicide using a firearm will have owned that firearm for 7 to 10 years. So, it went against this myth that, that's why we have the 10-day waiting period and all that. But we always thought, no, these people have had their guns for a while, and then they had a rough patch, and then they use their firearms. What the data actually shows, and I think this next slide will even though, just look at the drop off and then I'll explain. I know you can't possibly read those numbers. But there's a study that was done just a couple of years ago, handgun ownership and suicide in California. And what they found, of the 1,200 suicides that occurred over this 12-year period, and I think they were looking at over 200,000 people or something, more than 50% of those suicides occurred within the first year of ownership of that firearm. So of all those suicides, more than 50% happened within the first year. And as you see, fairly big influx right after those first 10 days, but that's because of the 10-day waiting period. So once folks can get access to that gun, and this is not to be too, philosophical or something, but there's a temptation to it. There's a draw to it. I'll circle back to that idea in a little bit. Now, one of the reasons why this is so important is here's firearm sales over the last few crises that we've had in our world, with the highest being the COVID pandemic. It saw the highest percentage of firearm sales in our state the longest time. Now, the hardest part about coming to terms with that is most of the gun shops weren't open for firearm safety instruction during that time period. So what we saw was a huge influx of firearms into our community for first-time owners, and yet they didn't have the ability. It was hard to buy gun locks, it was hard to buy gun safes, it was nearly impossible to take a firearm safety course. And so we need to partner with the firearm community and get those folks who purchase those guns to say, hey, it's never too late to learn gun safety, come back, take a class. And as you're gonna learn in a little bit, one of the key efforts of my statewide work is partnering with firearm instructors to include suicide prevention in the work that they do. Knowing that 6 out of 10 firearm deaths are suicides, not homicides, it's irresponsible to do a 10-hour safety course and not talk about suicide. That is the predominant way that people are dying by firearms. And they've been hugely receptive. It's really cool. If you're interested in learning more about firearm suicides, I want to encourage you to check out the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence from the Education Fund to Stop Gun Violence. What it really does is it goes beyond the Means Matter site that I mentioned previously and really gets into some of the theory about how we can make a difference from a theory standpoint when it comes to firearm suicide prevention. So this basically outlines some of the pieces. I talked earlier about substitution. Substitution is unlikely. People are pretty tied to the mean and method that they choose. If substitution is to occur, it's more than likely going to be to a less lethal mean. At a minimum, what we're trying to do is to delay that attempt. One thing that people surprised to find out, Dr. Stanley and Brown, who created the safety plan intervention, they did a study and they referred to what's known as the suicide risk curve. We oftentimes think of suicidal as static, right? You're either suicidal or you're not. And I personally don't even like the term suicidal because if you're a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail. And if you're suicidal, again, you're either are or you're not. And that doesn't account for people who are every waking moment thinking about suicide, or people on the other end of the spectrum who just kind of every once in a while it pops into their head. The reality is there's a huge chasm between those individuals and we need to respond to them differently. But even for the person who thinks about suicide fairly frequently, fairly constantly, a lot of people don't know that the actual moments where they are capable of suicide last about 30 to 90 minutes. They're not just in crisis 100% capable all of the time. And so one thing to remind friends and family, mental health professionals, healthcare providers, law enforcement, first responders, is time is on our side. People do not spontaneously combust because they say the aspirin. If someone is in that complete crisis and thinking about suicide, we need to sit with them and say, okay, let's talk about suicide and realize that time is on our side. This is why when I was in the EMT and I was responding to my first call, they called it downshift. This is when we downshift and slow everything down. Obviously, if it's an active scene, that means methods are already present, temp has already occurred, that doesn't apply to that. But if someone's in crisis, just sit with them. I have a story to tell you. I went to a gun shop down in San Diego a few years ago, and I'm not sure if any of you are in the firearm community. I'm sure some of you are. But you may not be aware that some gun shops, especially kind of the older guy gun shops, are kind of like barber shops. People come, they just kind of hang out. They're not buying guns, they're not touching guns, they just kind of hang out. And I went to this good old boys place down in San Diego, and there's a bunch of old dudes, and I walked in, and they thought I was this young buck who didn't know anything. And I let them lecture me for about 30 minutes about all this misinformation about firearm suicide, and then I, spent some time correcting them. And I told them about that, gracefully correcting them, but I spent some time talking to them about that suicide risk, that 30 to 90 minute window I just mentioned. And I came back to this gun shop about, 2 or 3 months later, and that same old guy that was glaring at me and mad dogging me the whole time was there. And he said, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" I was like, "Oh, damn. Yeah, let's go." And he pulled me aside, and he said, "I was here last time you came," and I was like, "Yeah, I remember you." He said, "I thought you were full of fill in the blank." I was like, "Okay, thank you for letting me know." And he said, "A couple weeks after that, my wife passed away. And a couple days after that, I found myself sitting on my couch with my firearm in my hand. And somewhere in the deep recesses of my brain, even though I tried so hard to forget everything that you said, I remember you said something about 30 to 90 minutes. So I set an alarm on my watch for 90 minutes. I said, okay, if I want to kill myself in 90 minutes, I'll do it." He said, "Sure as could be, about 45 minutes in, the pain wasn't quite as intense." He set the firearm down and went to bed. That's not perfect science. That's not magic. That's just sometimes helping people to understand. In my opinion, you can go read all the Steinman and Thomas Joyner theories about suicide, and capability and burdensomeness and all those things. In my opinion, it's pain and hope. Suicide happens when pain outweighs hope. And we can deal with a tremendous amount of pain. It's when that hope starts to slip that that's when the danger starts to resolve. So in that moment, as a professional, as a friend, as a family member, when we're talking to somebody, don't get distracted by the pain. Try to understand the pain, listen to the pain, honor their negative, but try to focus on the hope. What can I do to make you want to be here tomorrow? Because when I lost my buddy Jesse, I thought suicide was about wanting to die. And it wasn't until I went through my own struggles that I realized suicide is not about wanting to die. It's about not wanting to live. And that sounds like the same thing, but they are two very different things. So in that moment, it's not about convincing people not to die. It's about helping them find the reasons for living. And this is true across every intervention that I can think of. But going back to my actual slides that I'm here to talk to, here's the socio-ecological model. So again, I would encourage you to go to the website. I'm happy to share these slides if people want them. But the Education Fund to Stop Gun Violence and Prevent Firearm Suicide. It's just a phenomenal website to give you more of that theory. Now, one of the first projects to jump into this arena is called the Gun Shop Project. It came out of NAMI, New Hampshire National Alliance on Mental Illness. I'm sure many of you are either affiliated or associated. I was on the board of NAMI San Diego for a long time. Now, the problem was when we tried to bring this program to California, we had a little bit different gun laws than New Hampshire. New Hampshire, live free or die. In California, it's a little different. So anyways, we had to update some of the language, but I was put in charge of updating the materials and then taking this project to San Diego. And I was so impressed. San Diego County has one of the largest numbers of firearm distributors in our state. And I was so shocked when I found out that 99% of them, I would go to these gun shops and talk to them, 99% of them got on board. They are also loss survivors. The last thing they would ever want to do is sell a firearm that is used in a suicide. So we've got to get away from this us versus them mentality. We have to embrace the firearm community, knowing they are the gatekeepers to this. But we were able to distribute a variety of materials. Again, also we were able to give away free gun launch. It was a fairly successful effort. One of the other things that we did is we worked with a couple gun shops who offer storage, and we got them to agree that if someone came in with the code word gun shop project, that they could store their firearms for free or on one shop at a discounted rate. And this is about getting the firearms out of the home for that temporary period of time. And one of the things is we really need to, if the firearm community wants to be left alone and they don't want Big Brother coming in, then we have to change the mindset to accountability. And it's on you to get the firearms out of the home and make that as easy as possible. And so taking them to gun shops is one option. Unfortunately, fewer and fewer gun shops in our state are continuing to offer firearm storage, let alone for suicide. but there's some conversations in how we can remove that. In fact, Louisiana, I just learned, it's kind of a good Samaritan law for gun shops. So if they store firearms knowingly for someone who has thoughts of suicide, they give those guns back. They're not at fault. Now, some people would argue, well, isn't the responsibility there? But they're doing the best they can. So why would we discourage them from trying to do the best that they can in that space? So when AFSP, I think many of you, I understand that the sponsor are supporting this. So you also have firearm materials. One of the pieces that I share with the gun shops that I work with is this guide for post-vention and the firearms for gun ranges. Really interested to hear that, what protocols. I don't get into details publicly, but there are certain protocols that a gun shop can put into place to reduce risk of firearm suicides in their location. But I've been asked not to speak to those, but I can talk to you offline a little bit about that. But so we also partner, and share those materials as well. There's some other states. Colorado's done some great work. Utah's done some great work. What I want to talk about for a few minutes before I close out with a little bit more story time. So it was mentioned that I'm part of a statewide effort to bring mean safety to the communities. So this is a new website, just got launched this month. It's called Striving for Safety. I realize the link's not even on here. Oops. Sorry about that. It's strivingforsafety.org. What we're trying to do with this website, this is a public-facing website. While there's information for professionals, this is to help empower friends and family members to make their environments more safer for loved ones, whether they live in the same residence, whether they have a friend or family member living outside of their residence. Through the website, we cover various aspects of being safety, so firearm safety, poisoning, overdose, suffocation, strangulation, signage and barriers. When you come to the different websites, you'll also see, for example, this is the firearm page we have for in the home, and then as well as information for retailers and ranges. When you go to the overdose and poisoning page, there's similarly for in the home or information for pharmacists. But what we're hoping that you can do, say you're a school counselor, say you're a mental health professional, and you're trying to help build mean safety around the person that you're serving, that you could pull up this website next to your client and say, hey, have you thought about this? Here's some other things that you can continue to do. That someone might send this to a colleague, a friend, a family member that they're worried about. Hey, are there some steps in here that you can take to help safeguard your home? Now, specifically when it comes to firearms, we go through the different aspects, again, from least restrictive to most restrictive. First, we wanted to help people understand that, yeah, sometimes getting that firearm out of the home is one of the safest things we can do, whether that's at a gun shop. But one thing that a lot of people don't know is that the penal code in California has actually been outdated. This is a little secret. Actually, when I had a meeting with the Attorney General of our state of California, they didn't even know this law was real. It's called a safe harbor law. And so let's say Robert's he is my friend, but let's say that he's worried about me. And he says, hey Stan, I'm worried about you. I think I should hold on to your guns. And I say, all right, let's do it. 5 years ago, that would have been a felony for him and for me if law enforcement found out about it. What this safe harbor law does is it gives an exemption only for suicide risk for him to come over and say, hey buddy, you're not safe, you're not doing well, you're thinking about suicide, we talked about it, I'm gonna hold on to your guns. Now he can't be prohibited from owning firearms, which means he has to have a firearm permit. He has to have a way to store them safely, ideally in a gun safe, but at a minimum with gun locks. He can disarm the firearms. Even short of that, even if I weren't willing to, he could put a gun lock on my gun and keep the key. He could take all the ammo or whatever it may be. But this is a hugely underutilized thing, because I think this is the most real world application of this, is to have someone we know, someone we trust, without any paperwork, without law enforcement, without a gun shop, saying, hey buddy, I want to hold on to your guns. I'm going to be part of your care team and we're going to continue to talk. And so one of the efforts that I want to integrate with the materials that I'm bringing into this campaign is an accountability from the jump. This goes for more than just firearm suicide prevention, but we always come to this mentality of suicide prevention from this whack-a-mole mentality of, okay, everybody be ready for crisis. And if you see crisis, jump in and fix the crisis. What I'm trying to do with this firearm stance and this new project is, it should be a core tenet. If 60% of firearm deaths are suicides, let's not wait for a crisis. What I'm trying to push for firearm owners to do is right now, while everything is going good, to have a conversation with their buddies and say, hey, just learned about this new penal code update. Will you do me a favor? If I ever need you to hold on to my guns because I'm struggling a little bit, will you do that for me? okay, well, you promised that you will ask me the same and we'll be willing to have a conversation. So now, when thoughts of suicide are present, it's not so awkward to have that conversation and to take those steps. So we're just trying to remove those barriers. So I think we already talked about counseling on lethal means earlier in the day. If you don't know about it, you should know about it. There's a 2-hour online training through Zero Suicide that's available, and hopefully everybody know about safety planning. That was 0 hands, so let's talk about safety planning. Safety planning is, again, one of the most recommended strategies for, again, with counseling or reducing access to lethal means. When someone's having thoughts of suicide, it's about teaching someone to swim against the rip current rather than hoping there's a lifeguard on duty. The safety plan template's been updated. The website was updated with some really good training vignettes. Unfortunately, that's been a little bit wonky as of late, but I encourage you to keep checking back. I do know that the forums space still works. We're going to do Q&A in just a second. Before we get to that, I think
You have 5 more minutes.
I have 5 more minutes, and then Q&A? Yes. Sweet. All right. I'm going to tell you a little story, and before I do that, I want to share this with you. I know we're a mix of friends, family, loss survivors, attempt survivors, lived experience, healthcare professionals, behavioral health professionals. But I was reading this book, it's called Care of the Soul by Dr. Thomas More. And while I don't think he was speaking directly to suicide, this quote really stood out to me. But it says, the Greeks told the story of the Minotaur, the bull-headed, flesh-eating man who lived in the center of the labyrinth. He was a threatening beast, and yet his name was Asterion, which means star. I often think about this paradox as I sit with someone with tears in her eyes, searching for some way to deal with a death, a divorce, or depression. It is a beast, this thing that stirs in the core of her being, but it is also the star of her innermost nature. We have to care for this suffering with extreme reverence so that in our fear and anger at the beast, we do not overlook the star. We have to stop being so scared and angry at suicide that we overlook the star. We get so mad at suicide that we forget that a lot of times the reasons that brought this person to these thoughts of suicide are because they are so compassionate, because they are so loving, because they are so wonderful, because they are such a good helper that they neglected to take care of themselves. We have got to get rid of the fear of the beast of suicide. And I want to close, and I'm not allowing myself enough time for this story, so I apologize for that. About a year and a half ago, I was in my own rough patch. This is coming from a guy who worked at suicide prevention for over 20 years, who was leading a statewide campaign for mean safety. And I had literally broken my leg, so my body was, broken. And in the course of that, through the medications, messing with my head and personal life events, my soul and my heart got broken. And I came home one night, just with the worst of it, thinking everything had fallen out. Even though I know all the research, and I know all the things, I have all the data and all the talking points and all the stuff, and I apologize if this is activating. I found myself sitting by my wood stove one night with a gun in my hand and a bottle in the other, wondering, why should I not pull this trigger? And as I was sitting there, there was a song that came on. It's called Needle Fall Down by Charles Wesley Godwin. So I'm just sitting there trying to figure this out and listen to music, and this song comes on. And I want to read the lyrics to you. It comes on, it says, time in the evening I pulled out my gun, prepared for what's after, I poured something strong. I yearn for the rope and the lady's sweet voice, sing me my last words, and I'll sing along. Needle fall down, sing me a song, it's been a long life and all went wrong. And that song, this piece of music, was enough for me to put that gun down. It's not a healthy strategy. I decided to just keep drinking until I passed out, but I kept the gun out of my hand. And I woke up the next morning and went to my brother, so scared about how this conversation would go. And I went up to him and I asked him, can you hold on to my guns? I'm not safe. And he said, of course, I love you. And he hugged me. And that was it. He didn't call me a sissy. He didn't demean me. He said, absolutely. And he was there for me throughout the course until I got better, until I healed. I wasn't broken, I was injured. But I needed to acknowledge, and this is something we need to teach firearm owners, is that while we want to perceive that we own firearms to be protectors, and we have this protector mentality, if I am having thoughts of suicide, I am the biggest danger to my friends and my family and their wellness. And so to protect them, I need to get those guns out of my space and out of my vicinity. And that's about accountability, and that's about courage, and that's about strength. So we need to change this, and we need to get rid of these fears. We need family and friends to be more accountable and talk about these things sooner. We need the individual who's having these thoughts to be accountable and be willing to talk about this better. We need mental health professionals to be accountable and not be so scared of liability or doing the right thing or saying the right thing, but to be willing to jump in the mud with us and help us find our reasons for living. So on that note, thank you for your time. I'll open it up for questions.
Do you guys have some online? We'll let you start with one or two and then we'll go live and then we'll go back to you.
I understand not using the word commit, and what do you say instead of attempt, failed, successful as it relates to suicide? What words would you use instead of committed, unsuccessful, etc., that is more sensitive and caring?
Oh, that's my fault. I told you how to do it wrong. I didn't tell you how to do it right. So instead of using the term commit, we prefer to use the term died of suicide, or took their own life. We're not trying to hide what happened. We're just trying to break that association of crime or sin. As opposed to successful or unsuccessful failed attempts, we ask that people simply use the term attempted or death by suicide. Again, it's very clear from each of those what the result was. But again, if it's a failed attempt, that means the person's alive and that's not a failure. So death by suicide, attempted suicide. There was one study that was done of people with lived experience, loss survivors, attempt survivors, and that was approved and recommended terminology. So great question.
Is there a template for outlining main safety on a safety plan?
It's part of the safety plan, but as far as outlining it, really comes back to the training. So I would first start with the counseling on lethal means. It's available. You don't have to be a mental health professional to attend that training. Again, it's on the Zero Suicide website. It's a 2-hour online training. But as far as templates, I would say check out strivingforsafety.org. I don't know why I'm looking at you. The person's online, but strivingforsafety.org. Hopefully that would be a good place to start as well.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. Thank you so much for your transparency and lived experience.
Thank you.
Anyone in the room have a question? Like to pose for Stan? Oh.
No, I have to
Oh.
Well, then wait for the mic because we won't be able to hear you. Here she's coming.
Thank you so much. And I'm a survivor as well. And one thing I want to ask is, I think there's so much focus on what are we going to do, what are we going to do, what are we going to do. But you mentioned one thing, that it's about the individual, and that's, that is the case. What is the reason? And you said that people, the hope the pain outweighs the hope. I think the question of why is the individual doing it? That's probably what it's away me the most.
Yeah, I mean, it does, and I think everybody has their own why. And being safety is about just trying to push the danger away until I can figure out my why to stay. What is my reason to stay? That took a long time. I think philosophically, all of us at some point in our lives, even if we don't think about suicide, like, what the hell am I even doing here? But it's about, I think it's, whatever leads to that pain, whatever that why is, it's about just giving ourselves time to figure out the other half of the equation. And sometimes that's longer and harder for others. And some of us have more whys, than others. So I don't know if I'm really answering, or I'm not really sure where the question was there, but yeah, I don't know. And for those of you who are supporting someone, who have supported someone, or mental health professionals that have never been in that mental space where you've questioned whether or not you want to be here tomorrow, the one thing I would ask of you is allow it for it to be a possibility that someone feels that is the truth. Let's start there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. I appreciate your personal experience with all of this. I've worked in the field working with people that are suicidal or lost their way to suicide. A question I have is, have you studied the genetic component to this? Because I've known families that have lost a lot of family members to suicide.
Yeah, well, anybody who knows me will tell you my IQ doesn't break the bank, so I don't get into the science and genetics. What I can tell you though is, I don't know, genetics or not, yeah, absolutely, suicide can be impacted among family members, but I think it has less to do with genetics, because I don't think anything is predetermined as much as My best friend, I told you that I lost my freshman year. A couple years ago, we had buried his brother to death by suicide. And there was nothing genetic there. It's because they shoved it in a closet, they swept it under a rug, and it became a combustible thing. And that's the danger. If you bring it out in the sunlight, you go to find whatever supports you need as a survivor. But most people who lose somebody to suicide wait anywhere from 7 to 10 years before they find support. So that's why programs like Survivors of Suicide Loss, or I think they're trying to do one here in LA, a loss team, where they actively respond with first responders, suicide loss survivors, accompany first responders onto the scene. What they found is it's an average of like 2 to 4 weeks before those people are getting that type of support. So I don't mean to disregard your question. I just don't know the answer on the genetic level. Maybe one day we'll find something, but I think we just have to do a better job. Like even today, I heard a couple of people say they lost someone to suicide. I always tell people what the first question should be: what was their name? What were they like? Tomorrow I'm going to be in San Diego for the Survivors of Suicide Loss Walk. You know, we do an activity where we have people post little cards. What was their favorite snack? What was their favorite song? What was their, when we lose somebody to suicide, their manner of death encapsulates or becomes all that they ever were. And we have to do a better job of understanding that was one portion of their life, and helping people understand, you know, because I've been part of the conversation, oh, they died by suicide, and it's awkward silence, and then the conversation ends. Say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. What were they like? What was their name? So, anyways. See one more hand. Are we allowed to do one more?
I just want to say thank you so much for being so
Still, okay, sorry. Go ahead.
and sharing your story, and I think you have a special calling. Just curious, you mentioned you provide education at the shooting at the stores where they sell the firearms.
Yeah.
Do you also do that at the shooting ranges?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. So I work with both gun shops, and at the gun shops, we have them distribute the information, distribute the materials. You know, some just kind of passively put them out, some put them in with each firearm sale, some post them on the walls. But yeah, the more important component, I think, is working directly with the firearm instructors. So I train the firearm instructors to include information on suicide. So they're typically either 3, 6, 8, you know, I mean, there's a variety of levels of courses, but just have them speak for about 10 minutes on suicide prevention. So I don't want to come in and be the outside guy. I want them, the firearm instructor is the trusted source. I want them to have this conversation with their students. Sorry if that wasn't clear.
Thank you for the work you're doing. You mentioned coming from a family of law enforcement.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you are in the works for the programs of being safety for law enforcement.
For them as professionals?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's something the International Police Chiefs Association has put out some reports and some recommendations and protocols. That is one of the tougher ones. It's not as simple in law enforcement about taking away their duty weapon. It's also about typically they have firearms at home. It's a little easier when working with other types of first responders, firefighters, and EMTs, where firearm is not part of their profession. But restricting access to lethal means for law enforcement is extremely difficult. But again, it comes back to that accountability, that protector mentality, and it comes back to each individual agency. You know, is it a large enough agency where they can put them on a light duty without shaming them in front of their peers? Because like the doctor mentioned previously, we don't also want to take away the purpose. You know, one of my frustrations with the military is it's like fighter pilots having thoughts of suicide, they pull them out of the plane. It's like, you just took away everything they worked their entire life for. So I don't know that it's clean and clear, but I think with law enforcement and first responders, those peer support programs are hugely effective. Letting them know, a lot of folks don't know about Copline. Copline's a 24/7 crisis line that's staffed by retired law enforcement officers. So it's also about giving them avenues outside of their ranks to get the support that they need.
Yeah, I think we have another couple questions online. Is there any stats on suicide because of domestic violence and intimate partner violence?
Yeah, there are. It's not my field of expertise, but yeah, I mean, domestic violence. And one thing I would say about this, and I hope this comes out the right way, the suicide risk is not just there for the victim, but also oftentimes the perpetrator, and that's something that we miss a lot. So one of the things I do when I train first responders is I train them to engage in suicide risk screening on both ends of the spectrum. So any form of trauma and victimization can of course increase risk for suicide. And again, it's hard to find sympathy for perpetrators of that. My family has definitely been a part of it. So I understand both sides, but yeah, I mean, that's a combustible situation all the way around. So I don't have actual data though, there's probably somebody.
Did you guys have another question online? No, okay, anyone, back there? We have one back there for Nima, and I'll have one more here, and I think those will be the last two.
Hi, thank you. My name is Edgar. I'm volunteering with NAMI Greater Los Angeles chapter. And I'm not too familiar with the gun laws or regulations, but I was interested in what you said about like the first year that people purchase guns is like when a lot of the suicides happen. So I was just wondering, as far as like references go for before people get or purchase a gun, references that friends or family they may have that need to come in and almost like vouch for them to be able to get that firearm. How adamant are the laws about that? And do you think that this is, do they emphasize enough on that? And do you think this is important?
I think I heard your question, like you should almost need like, you need referrals to get a job, you should get.
Yeah,
referrals.
exactly, because right now, if I have a few friends that if they had me as a reference, I'd be like, yeah, no, you shouldn't put a gun in that.
I mean, I see where you're going with that. I don't think it would ever happen. There's the 2A, the Second Amendment, right to bear arms is so strong that that would probably never happen. I think more importantly, this is in conflict with many people in the firearm community. Right now, you need a permit and you need to wait 10 days, but you're not required to take a safety course. I think that would be a better first step that's more reasonable. Like I have no problem as a responsible gun owner requiring people to have, but again, a lot of people disagree with that because it's infringing upon their rights. So I hear what you're saying, and it's not a bad idea. But there's also times, when the red flag laws have been used maliciously, there is a good process for getting that cleared up. So, but I totally agree. There's buddies of mine that I'd be like, oh no. So yeah, I don't really have a good answer on that one, but I think it's more about hopefully some of the steps I'm taking will alleviate it.
Thank you.
All right, we're gonna take one last question and then turn it back over to Dr. Fung.
Hi, so I just had a question just because you had talked about all this information. So my question would be, just from your standpoint, what would be an appropriate, or I guess something to say to someone who stigmatizes suicide or shames a person for having an attempt? Like what would be an appropriate thing to tell that person?
I don't have an appropriate thing to tell that person, but what do you mean, like from a mental health professional or?
Well, not from a mental health professional, but just in general, because you work with this. And the only reason
Oh, like-
I say that is just because, we all can work in this, we can say, oh, that's not right. But, just in general, I think if like we start becoming more familiar with just common things to say to someone that maybe is not, like saying that word or, they're in the wrong. But yeah, I just wanted to see like, what would you tell?
So like if someone.
I guess in random conversation.
Like they were getting to know somebody and somebody said, oh, I attempted suicide once, and they said something ignorant or something to them.
Or like people.
Why would you do that? That's crazy, or that's selfish or something like that.
Yeah, because like I've noticed when I worked with some of my clients, a lot of them are like, I'll feel really shamed by like my people I see or people I work with and my family, and I think that's just really hard for clients just to know, right? Because we're always worried about people's other assumptions, right? So I can tell them, oh, maybe you can say this. I think I just wanted to hear it from somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do a lot of work with lived experience and storytellers, and first off, helping them to understand not everybody needs to know, and who's going to be safe to know this type of information. If it's a family member or relatives who already know, then it's out there. Man, I could go on this one. This could be a whole nother hour. I don't know. I really don't have an answer. I think that more and more people are starting to realize the courage in coming forward and talking about this, the courage that suicide is not a weak act. It's not a place that comes from weakness. Yeah, I don't have a good one off the top. I'm sorry to fail you on this one. I'll think about it. Yeah, I would say the other thing would get somebody who can say whatever they want to that person, pull them aside and set them straight. But I think I'm done, so thank you everyone. It's nice to meet you.